Hello and welcome to this presentation. My name is Elke Fein. I'm a social and political scientist working at the Institute for Integral Studies, and I'm currently coordinating a 3-year EU-funded project on political innovations, paving the way to a more integral politics, and it's called Leadership for Transition. This presentation is also to do with integral politics and, of course, with the developmentally informed political science. It is a super short version of a paper that I'm currently preparing for a special issue on integral politics by Integral Review. And the paper builds on many years of experience of studying adult development and political science, and on a personal experience of trying to bring a couple of integral insights into German politics, which kicked off quite interesting, even though not always positive dynamics, and that's both personally and substantially. So the paper is called Making Germany Great Again, or Learning to Dance with the Elephant, the Pre-Trans Fallacy in German, European and Identity Politics. And whoever is interested in reading the full draft, please let me know. My email address is on the opening slide, and I'm happy to share it and to receive some more feedback on this. So this paper takes a developmental lens at discursive patterns observed in the public debate around the Euro crisis, which gave rise to the German Alternative Party, AfD, in 2013. And since I have been involved in this project to some degree in its very early days, due to my critique of the non-democratic character of some of the so-called rescue measures to save Greece from bankruptcy, it is also a personal interpretation of the given elements in hindsight, as I am making sense of them from my more or less developmentally informed perspective. My core claim is first that the polarization that Germany has experienced over the last years, and that's essentially before Corona, but also continuing up until now, the polarization in connection with what came to be called a right-wing populist party has deeper roots in a dynamic interplay between all involved political forces. Beneath their diverging perceptions of the challenges at stake and appropriate ways to resolve them was a power struggle that revealed typical patterns of first-tier politics. And to give you just a brief summary up front, the German Alternative Party was originally founded around a liberal conservative agenda that combined political and socioeconomic concerns, which I argue it coordinated in a meta-systematic way. However, instead of engaging in a more serious deliberation about the arguments brought forward by the alternative, mainstream politics essentially responded by typical self-defensive reflexive of a first-tier power struggle, where a competitor is by definition an opponent that must be fought. So by starting to call it populist and anti-European, its competitors simplified the matter, negating the underlying root conflict and thereby downgrading the level of discourse from post to pre-conventional. So that's my second core claim. Looking at these discursive dynamics based on the vertical complexity of how the various positions are framed, I argue that the dynamics of the discursive struggle can be explained by what Ken Wilber calls a pre-trans fallacy. In other words, by part of the discourse misconceiving and hence failing to adequately address the developmental complexity of the discourse of the competitors. And beyond that, I argue that the perceived problem of anti-European populism has actually been co-created by those who are now so passionately deploring it. And by the way, Wilber has also recently made a similar claim in response to the election of Donald Trump in the US in his booklet, Trump and the Post-Truth World, where he argues that the green social, political, and cultural code, being the leading edge in most Western countries, has itself considerably contributed to the rise of populist movements. First, by its nihilism, questioning all grand meta-narratives and truth claims, and second, by its own narcissism, which implicitly supposes but never openly states that its own values and perception of the world are more developed, more moral, and thus more true than those of the more traditional voices. And Wilber concludes, quote, "As green had collapsed, evolution had no choice but to take up a broadly anti-green atmosphere as it tried to self-correct the damage," end of quote. So Trump was definitely pre-conventional, which is not the case in the case of what we discuss here today. So I will organize the rest of my presentation in 5 steps. First, briefly explaining the concept. Second, looking at the political agenda of the German alternative from a developmental perspective. Then exploring the discursive dynamics generated by the power struggle around discursive hegemony. And step 4 is making a claim about deeper roots of these dynamics. And finally, I will suggest the developmentally informed avenues for transcending polarization. So to start with Wilber's concept of the pre-trans fallacy, he has coined that for describing confusions of different states and or stages of development due to a lack of distinction between actual behaviors, and that includes verbal behaviors, positions, decisions, and their structural complexity. More precisely, it is a way of describing the fact of mistakenly qualifying a person or their behavior as either higher or lower in stage than they actually are, because the evaluator themselves has no access to the respective higher stage. Therefore, they base their evaluation on certain externally observable behavioral indicators while disregarding the complexity of the other's specific motivations or justifications, because these are too complex for them to grasp. So while pre and trans often look similar at a superficial level, as the example of Kohlberg's Heinz dilemma beautifully shows, the criterion for distinguishing between them is the level of complexity by which the respective speaker or position perceives and responds to the given challenge. Perceptions and solutions stemming from pre-realms tend to be simple black and white, either or, right or wrong, whereas perceptions and solutions coming from a trans realm are based on a more complex analysis of the problem involved, including more quadrants, more dimensions, and more levels of meaning making. As another example, I can briefly show the quotes that Wilber is using when he explains the concept in his theory of everything. And he's using arguments against the Vietnam War stemming from different levels of moral development. So based on Wilber's concept of the pre-trans fallacy, I argue that some of the discursive positions that are often criticized as anti-European by mainstream, mostly green liberal, pro-European discourses are actually more differentiated than what the critics perceive or reconstruct them to be. And inversely, so-called pro-European positions are sometimes less differentiated and, from a developmental perspective, less progressive than what their proponents claim them to be. Now, when I speak about the German Alternative Party, I am only referring to the early Alternative for Germany, the AfD 1.0, as I call it in my paper, in its first year of existence, that's 2013, before it was taken over by the more right-wing national conservative camp in mid-2015. As I said already, the party was originally founded around a liberal conservative agenda that combined political values such as democratic accountability with socioeconomic values such as financial sustainability and a focus on basic values and principles of European integration, which I argue it coordinated in a meta-systematic way. Its competing analysis of the Greek debt crisis and the related euro currency crisis was informed by widely shared economic expertise. And it's important to say that the party had an impressive number of macroeconomic professors as its founding members who had actually previously tried unsuccessfully to make themselves heard by the government for many months, and only after they weren't successful, they decided that the only way out of this was to found their own party. So it was created as an opposition and explicit alternative to the government's politics of bailing out Greece in the name of peace and stability. The policy recommendations which the party derived from its analysis suggested to stop some of what mainstream pro-European politics was doing to address the crisis, especially breaching EU law and severely challenging established standards of financial responsibility and democratic budget control. Note that the early alternative was neither against the common currency altogether and even less against the EU, but it did suggest to carefully reconsider some of the Eurozone's financial integration steps as a way to serve and maintain the common currency stability and to maintain ultimately also the EU's basic political goals and purpose, namely to guarantee peace, good neighborhood, and well-being across the EU in the long run. So the various logics, demands, and dynamics of these various systems, economic, financial, political, and EU relational, were coordinated with each other. And the table shows that to some degree. So my claim here is that this in itself is a meta-systematic operation. This does not imply that it is the only possible meta-systematic position, but the questions that the alternative raised are meta-systematic questions, such as which economic tools and which political decisions are needed to preserve an overall goal or principle, essentially the sustainability of peace and stability and well-being in the EU. So trying to bring various systems into a healthy alignment with each other, serving a larger goal. However, by its political opponents, questioning mainstream EU politics was criticized as a nationalist agenda. And this leads us to step 3, the discursive dynamics of this power struggle. Now, it is difficult to say if mainstream political discourse either failed or refused to address the alternative 1.0's concerns about the appropriate, presumably meta-systematic level of deliberation. All we can say from observation is that what it did instead was to narrow down the conversation to a debate about being either pro or anti-Europe or European. I can show that mainstream discourse used 3 typical strategies described in Laclau and Mouffe's discourse theory that I have used in my PhD. These strategies are antagonism, chains of equivalence, and the logic of difference. So they used these to build up or at least to amplify a strong moral antagonism between what came to be 2 opposing camps, while claiming the label of being good Europeans exclusively for themselves, of course. Developmentally speaking, these discursive strategies implied downgrading the discourse to a pre-conventional either or a conventional right-wrong level. When the alternative itself asked what are the right tools to serve a shared political goal, it essentially offered post-conventional, post-mainstream trans solutions and went beyond simplistic conventional either or logics. In contrast, political mainstream basically perceived and reframed these simply as anti-mainstream, which they were, against the existing system, which happened to be the system of their own power, political and discursive, and hence reframed them as politically incorrect and illegitimate, and increasingly responded by those typical first-tier impulses of self-defense and enemy bashing. By starting to adopt the battle term of populism in this context, instead of engaging in a more serious deliberation about the arguments brought forward by the alternative, the self-defensive reflexes of populist bashing ultimately turned into a populist practice themselves. A core claim of the paper is therefore that the ruling party's failure to adequately respond to legitimate critique voiced by democratically self-organizing citizens essentially co-produced the political polarization between those two camps. And what's more, its refusal or inability to engage in a minimum amount of shadow work in this regard, and note that the alternative's positions were exactly what Merkel's CDU had promoted just a few years earlier, such as no bailouts, financial stability first, etc., etc. So this lack of reflexivity continues to increase the polarization, blocking any constructive dialogue and really transformative development that would be based on addressing the root cause of the conflict. So in this sense, even though today's alternative, which I call AfD 2.0, because it has significantly shifted its identity, can clearly not be seen as a trans initiative anymore, the passionate political theater of scandalization around it that has been going on since the beginning is at least half-hearted, hypocritical, and unconvincing as long as mainstream politics does not start to recognize and acknowledge its own contribution to the alternative's emergence in the first place. Having said that, there's another shadow element and a deeper root cause of why these dynamics unfolded in the way they did. And that is German history and the specific identity problems related to it. Germany's problematic history of excessive nationalism in the 20th century, I think, is the reason why the accusation of being anti-European was and still is such a powerful discursive weapon against anyone who challenges politics in power, or even who doesn't do that, but just voices an opinion that is a bit more critical of some European integration steps, because this accusation comes close to being a nationalist. And this in turn is the strongest possible stigma and an easy way to expel someone, including unwelcome political competitors, from the arena of political correctness and often from the arena of dialogue altogether. So whether or not the pre-trans fallacy in the debate about Europe and the Greek bailout was due to a conscious strategic choice, in other words, used as an instrument of first-tier power struggle against better knowledge, or an expression of the involved actors' actual developmental blindness, I cannot decide that based on the data. But nevertheless, the dominant conventional consensus about the lessons to be drawn from German history seems to be interpreted by many as having to meet the neighbors' expectations and sometimes even giving up certain national interests in order to demonstrate that Germany is a trustworthy partner who has learned their lesson. And the existential traumatic quality of this felt need to comply with perceived expectations must be considered as the deeper cause and condition of possibility of these dynamics. Otherwise, I guess that criticizing EU politics for what they are based on certain arguments would likely be less of an emotional, moral issue, dividing the political public. Finally, how can developmental approaches help to transcend this polarization? The short answer is, if the challenge is between systemic and meta-systematic positions, the solution might need to involve paradigmatic stage consciousness, able to integrate both. In other words, for finding productive ways of transcending the existing polarization, politics needs to take both dimensions of the conflict into account. First, the challenge to find sustainable solutions to the EU's political crisis, at the heart of which is a structurally unresolved socio-economical and currency crisis. And second, the specific challenges facing German historical identity politics in this regard. And I've tried to put this into a graph, which is less than perfect, I think. Anyway, moreover, the crisis of the EU is an invitation to a mature democratic Germany to further develop its political sense of self and of leadership in truly consciously post-conventional ways. In other words, owning both its historical responsibility and the political responsibility resulting from its own political and economic strength. And I don't have the time here to go into this more deeply, but I do so in the paper itself. And at this point, I'd just like to refer to the recent Citizens' Assembly on Germany's role in the world that has explored exactly this challenge and that has actually come up with some quite transformative results. So an ideal, more developed, more integral kind of political leadership would probably put Germany's power and responsibility in service of a lighter, yet more sustainably viable, more flexible, more fractal design of the EU, even if this at times implies to step out of the conventional comfort zone of being everybody's darling. And admittedly, for the time being, none of the existing political forces has demonstrated this level of perspective and approach. As to the alternative 1.0, the early alternative party, it was good at coordinating the logics, the needs, and the concerns of at least two systems, the democratic political one and the economic systems, respectively, as in the graph here. But it failed to address the dimensions of political culture and historical correctness in an equally adequate way. And subject to a more thorough analysis, it appears to have been the other way around for at least relevant parts of mainstream politics. So even if we concede some pockets of meta-systematic thinking there too, the repeated waves of scandalization and moral excitement around the alternative rather suggest that we are essentially dealing with robust systemic thinking here, while having internalized the rules of a specific system of historical political correctness. Mainstream politics seems as yet to be unable to contextualize the latter in a more independent, more post-conventional, principled way. So from the meta perspective taken here, it appears that each of the two camps is the shadow of the other, or as the Dalai Lama uses to say, sacred friends, so helping each other to look at deeply rooted learning challenges. On these grounds, I suggest that finding ways out of the polarization demands a degree of shadow and integration work that might need to go beyond mere meta-systematic cognition, and provided that the model of hierarchical complexity is at all an adequate tool to describe this, we're probably talking about a paradigmatic stage challenge here. So either way, it would require leadership to coordinate several both cognitive and social, psychological, emotional, interpersonal meta-systems simultaneously. In other words, a new paradigm, integral politics. So far from me here in this presentation, Thank you for watching this video. I'm looking forward to discuss this more with you at the ESRAD conference. Thanks.